Of all the American fighters that turned the tide in the Pacific, there was just one that could claim an astonishing 19-to-1 kill ratio. One aircraft that shot down more enemy planes than any other American fighter of the entire war. One fighter that won the most lopsided air battle in history, reducing Japan's naval air power to rubble in a single afternoon. And yet, if you ask most aviation enthusiasts to name the great carrier fighters of World War II, they'll tell you about the graceful Corsair, the nimble Zero, perhaps even the stubborn Wildcat. But the Hellcat, the aircraft that destroyed 5,223 Japanese aircraft, accounting for 56% of all U.S. Navy and Marine Corps air victories in the Pacific, is somehow relegated to the shadows. The name David McCampbell, the Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 kills, rings hollow compared to Pappy Boyington or Dick Bong. How did the most successful carrier fighter in history become aviation's forgotten champion? And more importantly, why does this workhorse deserve far more recognition than its flashier contemporaries? This is the story of the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat story begins not with triumph, but with desperation. By early 1942, American naval aviators were being slaughtered in the Pacific. Flying the stubby, underpowered F4F Wildcat, a mid-1930s design that had nearly been built as a biplane, they faced an opponent that outclassed them in nearly every measure of performance. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was faster, more maneuverable, and had greater range. American pilots were learning to survive through grit, tactics, and sheer bloody-mindedness. But survival wasn't victory. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, Long Island, had actually been working on a Wildcat successor since 1938. The initial concept was straightforward: a wilder Wildcat. Clean up the dumpy airframe, add firepower, replace that infuriating hand-cranked landing gear, and fit a bigger engine. On the 30th of June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the Navy signed a contract for the prototype XF6F1, but then came combat data, first from the skies over Britain and France, then from actual engagements in the Pacific. And what emerged from those early battles painted a sobering picture. American pilots didn't just need a better Wildcat. They needed something entirely different. The man behind the Hellcat's transformation was Roy Grumman himself. An MIT graduate and former Navy pilot who trained at Pensacola, Grumman understood both the engineering challenges and the operational realities of carrier aviation. He was a pilot who still flew the company hack, a civil version of Grumman's demanding F3F biplane, just to stay current. In the spring of 1942, shortly after the Battle of Midway, Grumman's partner Jake Swerble flew to Hawaii for a critical meeting. His objective: sit down with Commander John S. Jimmy Tack, the Wildcat ace who'd developed the famous tack-weave defensive maneuver. Tack and other combat veterans gave Swerble an earful. They needed armor plate, more guns, greater range, massive ammunition capacity, and above all, they needed power. The prototype XF6F1 had been fitted with a Wright R2600 engine, producing 1,700 horsepower. It simply wasn't enough. The solution was obvious: Pratt & Whitney's magnificent new R2800 Double Wasp, a two-stage supercharged 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing 2,000 horsepower. But here's where things get interesting. According to Vice Admiral Herbert Riley's account, the aeronautical engineering duty officers at the Bureau of Aeronautics initially resisted the R2800. Too much engine for that airplane, they said. The engine was scarce, and there were other priorities. What happened next is the stuff of legend. Two sharp Navy officers, Lieutenant Commander Arb Vossler and Lieutenant Commander George Anderson, the future Chief of Naval Operations, essentially stole one of the precious R2800 engines. They sent a Navy truck to Pratt & Whitney, had an inspector divert one of the new engines, and trucked it directly to Bethpage. Roy Grumman's test pilots fitted the engine to the prototype, took it up, and wrung it out. The performance improvement, as Riley recalled, was phenomenal. The difference between day and night. Vossler and Anderson took the test figures to Rear Admiral John Towers, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, dropped them in his hands, and said simply, "This is the engine that's right for the F6F." Before the morning was out, the engine designation was officially changed. The XF6F3, with its R2810, took to the air on the 30th of July 1942. Now, there's a persistent myth that needs addressing. Many histories claim the Hellcat's design was influenced by a captured Zero found nearly intact on Akutan Island in the Aleutians in June 1942. It's a compelling story, but it's not true. The Akutan Zero wasn't recovered until July, wasn't shipped to the United States until August, and repairs weren't completed until October 1942. By then, 2 models of the F6F had already flown, and the first production F6F3 made its maiden flight on 4th October, the same time the Zero was being reassembled. The design specifications for the Hellcat dated back to February 1941. The idea that Navy engineers studied the captured Zero and then instantly redesigned the Hellcat, acquired a new engine, reworked the airframe, and created a production version all within weeks is laughable. The Akutan Zero certainly affected Hellcat tactics, but the aeroplane's design, that was pure Grumman, guided by combat experience and built around the company's ironclad credo: make it strong, make it work, and make it simple. And simple it was. The Hellcat can almost be drawn with a ruler. Straight lines, trapezoidal wings, the largest of any single-engine World War II fighter, Allied or Axis. A massive, no-nonsense fuselage. This was not an aircraft designed to turn heads. It was designed to turn the war. The prototype XF6F3 became the production F6F3, nearly untouched. Remarkably, there were only 2 basic production versions throughout the Hellcat's entire career, the F6F3 and the F6F5, which featured an uprated R2810W with an additional 200 horsepower. That's it. No lengthy series of engine changes, no major airframe modifications. The Hellcat arrived in the Pacific, essentially complete. At peak production, Grumman was rolling a finished Hellcat off the assembly line every single hour. In just 30 months, the company built 12,275 Hellcats, better than 16 aircraft per day on a 6-day work week. The Navy actually had to ask Grumman to slow down, but when rumors circulated that layoffs might be coming, the entire workforce doubled down, each employee trying to prove they were indispensable. The result? Another production record. And here's the kicker. Hellcats were also a bargain. Despite their near-identical engines, the Navy could buy 5 F6Fs for the price of 3 F4U Corsairs. By early 1943, the first production Hellcats were being delivered to Fighting Squadron VF9 aboard the USS Essex. The airplane had gone from prototype to operational deployment in just 18 months. It was ready. The only question was, could it deliver? On the 31st of August 1943, the Grumman F6F Hellcat entered combat for the first time. The target, Marcus Island, a tiny speck in the Pacific, held by Japanese forces. Navy warplanes from the USS Essex and USS Yorktown launched their strikes, and among them leading the charge were the new Hellcats. The debut was unremarkable, which in a sense was exactly the point. The Hellcat worked straight out of the box. No teething troubles. No operational headaches. It was as Grumman had promised. Strong, functional, simple. Over the following months, Hellcats began replacing Wildcats across the fleet. By mid-1944, standardization was absolute. In June 1944, Task Force 58 in the Philippine Sea fielded 450 fighters. Then every single one was a Hellcat. At the October Battle of Lake Gulf, Task Force 38 had nearly 550 fighters, all Hellcats. This complete uniformity made maintenance, servicing, arming, and operations seamless. There were no mixed squadrons, no logistical nightmares, just Hellcats, endless Hellcats. But what made the F6F so devastatingly effective wasn't raw performance. On paper, the Corsair was faster, climbed better, and had greater range. The Hellcat's maximum speed, 386 miles per hour for the F6F5, was far below the Corsair's 452. And the P-38, P-47, and P-51 all topped out well into the mid-400s. But the Hellcat wasn't designed to fight Mustangs. It was designed to kill Zeros, and at that it was peerless. What the F6F offered was something no performance chart could capture: suitability. It was easy to fly, viceless, forgiving. Grumman claimed it had been designed to be flown by 200-hour farm boys, and while that was marketing hyperbole, it wasn't far from the truth. At a time when the Navy was welcoming thousands of inexperienced young ensigns, the Hellcat's gentle handling characteristics were not a trivial consideration. They were essential. Legendary British test pilot Eric Winkle Brown wrote, "No more outstanding example of skill and luck joining forces to produce just the right aeroplane is to be found than that provided by the Grumman Hellcat." The Hellcat's large wings, 334 square feet, gave it low wing loading, which meant comparatively slow carrier approach speeds, 5 miles per hour slower than the Wildcat, in fact. This made landing on a pitching carrier deck far less terrifying. And those big wings, while draggy and limiting top speed, made the Hellcat surprisingly maneuverable for such a heavy aircraft, though it was initially criticized for excessive longitudinal stability. The early F6F3's ailerons were heavy and sluggish at high speeds. The F6F5 cured this with spring-tab small automatic trim surfaces that boosted aileron effectiveness, and the Hellcat became genuinely nimble. Then there was durability. Roy Grumman, himself a former naval aviator, specified that the absolute last thing to fail on a Hellcat should be the cockpit. The pilot was surrounded by 212 pounds of armor plating, plus 2 additional sheets bracketing the oil tank just ahead of the instrument panel. Hellcats routinely returned to their carriers riddled with bullet holes. One landed with over 200, typical pilot quotes, more air going through it than around it, or simply, mostly holes where the aeroplane used to be. The Hellcat's combat record speaks for itself. On the 19th of June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American forces faced the largest Japanese carrier strike of the war. What followed became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most one-sided air battle in history. Over the course of that single day, Hellcat pilots and anti-aircraft gunners obliterated Japanese naval aviation. Wave after wave of enemy aircraft were shot down. Lieutenant Alex Versatility, flying from the USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in just 8 minutes. 11 Hellcats from the USS Hornet dove into a formation of over 50 Zeros and downed 22 of them. By the end of the day, over 600 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses minimal. The kill ratio was staggering. Japan's naval air power, painstakingly rebuilt after Midway, was effectively annihilated in an afternoon. The architect of the Hellcat's tactical dominance was Commander John Thack, the same man who'd advised Grumman on the aircraft's design. Thack understood the Zero's strengths, maneuverability, climb rate, and its weaknesses, fragility, lack of armor, poor high-speed handling. He trained Hellcat pilots never to dogfight, use superior speed and diving performance, hit hard, disengage, climb, repeat, don't turn with a Zero, don't give it a chance. The Hellcat's firepower made this doctrine devastatingly effective. Armed with 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, the F6F could deliver 2,400 rounds per minute. That's 40 rounds per second. Even a brief burst was lethal. And unlike the fragile Zero, which could be brought down by a handful of hits, the Hellcat could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. But the F6F wasn't invincible. While its kill ratio against the Zero was a staggering 13-1, it fared less impressively against more advanced Japanese designs. Against the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, powered by a 1,820 horsepower engine and flown by experienced pilots, the Hellcat's ratio dropped to 3.7-1. Flown by pilots of equal skill, the two aircraft would have been closely matched, and there were individual pilots who elevated the Hellcat to legendary status. None more so than Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's all-time leading ace. On the 24th of October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell and his wingman Ensign Roy Rushing launched from the USS Essex to intercept a massive Japanese strike force. What they found was extraordinary: 60 hostile aircraft heading for the American fleet, 60 enemy aircraft, 2 Hellcats. Most pilots would have radioed for help and shadowed the formation. McCampbell attacked. For the next 90 minutes, he and Rushing tore into the Japanese formation. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft that day, his second ace-in-a-day performance. Rushing down 6. Between them, they disrupted the entire strike, forcing the Japanese to jettison their bombs and abort the attack. McCampbell returned to the Essex with his fuel gauge reading 0. His guns were empty. He'd expended every round of ammunition. When he climbed out of his Hellcat Bureau number 70143, nicknamed Mincy III, he'd secured his place in history. By the end of the war, McCampbell had 34 confirmed kills, every one scored in a Hellcat. The F6F5N, the night fighter variant, added another dimension to the Hellcat's versatility. Equipped with an AN/airborne intercept radar, housed in a pod on the starboard wing, the -5N could hunt in total darkness. Some were armed with 220mm cannons in addition to the standard machine guns. Night fighter Hellcats became the scourge of Japanese nocturnal raids, patrolling the pitch-black skies above carrier task forces and interceptions enemy aircraft before they could strike. There were 1,432 night fighter Hellcats built, a substantial number that reflected the Navy's confidence in the design. Interestingly, Hellcats also served in the European theater, though this is often overlooked. Both US Navy and British Fleet Air Arm, Hellcats flew ground attack missions during the August 1944 invasion of southern France, a campaign largely forgotten because all eyes were on Normandy. British Hellcats also flew top cover for a major bombing raid against the German battleship Tirpitz on the 3rd of April 1944, when the supership was preparing to sortie from its Norwegian fjord. British Hellcats reportedly tangled with Luftwaffe Me-109s and FW-190s on the 5th of May 1944, though the after-action reports were confused. The Luftwaffe claimed 3 Hellcats for the loss of 3 Messerschmitts. The British claimed 2 F6Fs lost, possibly in a mid-air collision. The combats were brief and inconsequential. And frankly, an F6F versus a late-war 109 or 190 would have been an unfair fight. The Hellcat was a carrier-based aircraft, a collection of compromises. Folding wings, tailhook, heavy landing gear, and design features optimized for survival over vast ocean distances. It was never meant to dogfight Focke-Wulfs, but in the Pacific against the adversary it was designed to defeat, the Hellcat was unbeatable. By the time the last Hellcat stood down from combat operations in August 1945, it had flown 66,530 combat sorties and claimed 5,163 air-to-air kills. Its overall kill-to-loss ratio 19-1, the highest of any American fighter in World War II. And yet, despite this record, the Hellcat never captured the public's imagination. The Corsair, with its distinctive inverted gull wing and longer service life, became the star. The Hellcat quietly faded into the background. Even the original Blue Angels aerobatic team, which briefly flew Hellcats in 1946, replaced them with Bearcats after just 2 months. Why? Perhaps because the Hellcat's very virtues, reliability, simplicity, ease of use, lacked the glamour of more temperamental designs. The Corsair was an arrogant Shelby Cobra. The Hellcat was a Ford F350 pickup, dependable, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. After the war, most F6Fs were quickly relegated to training squadrons and reserve units. Radar-equipped F6F-5Ns remained in service as night fighters for a few more years, but by the late 1940s, the jet age had arrived, and the Hellcat was obsolete. The Hellcat's final combat missions came in an unexpected form, as drones. In August and September 1952, during the Korean War, 6 radio-controlled F6F-5Ks, each carrying a 1-ton bomb, were sent against a North Korean bridge and railway tunnel. These were proof-of-concept missions, demonstrations rather than serious strikes, and they achieved little. But the legacy of those drone Hellcats lived on. In 1953, the very first AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles were tested against F-6 F-5K drones flying above China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station. The first 12 Sidewinders missed, but the 13th came within 2 feet of its Hellcat target, close enough that a live warhead would have destroyed it. Today, Sidewinders remain the air combat weapon of choice for air forces worldwide, and they're predicted to stay in the U.S. inventory through most of the 21st century. Their development owes a debt to those bright orange Hellcat drones. One final, utterly bizarre chapter in the Hellcat story deserves mention: the Battle of Palmdale. On a sunny August day in 1956, a red F-6 F-5K drone took off from Naval Air Station Point Mugu, northwest of Los Angeles, bound for the test range, but the drone and its ground controller lost communication. The Hellcat turned southeast, climbing steadily directly toward the sprawling Los Angeles metropolis. Panic ensued. The Navy called for help from nearby Oxnard Air Force Base, home of the 437th Fighter Interceptor Squadron and their rocket-equipped Northrop F-89 Scorpions. 2 Scorpions scrambled, caught up with the Hellcat at 30,000 feet, and opened fire with their 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets. All 208 rockets missed. They did, however, set multiple brush fires on the ground, riddle houses and cars in Palmdale, and nearly ignite an explosives factory. The Hellcat, meanwhile, ran out of fuel, glided down, and crashed into the empty Mojave Desert, taking out some power lines on its way down. Even as a pilotless drone, the Hellcat proved harder to kill than expected. So what's the final assessment? In terms of pure performance, the Corsair was the superior aircraft. Faster, longer-ranged, better climb rate. The Corsair went on to serve with distinction in Korea, while Hellcats were relegated to training roles and target drones. But the Corsair was also difficult to fly, underwent a lengthy and troubled development, and had dangerous stall characteristics that made carrier operations challenging. The Hellcat sacrificed maximum performance for economy, manufacturability, and competent carrier handling. And in the context of 1943 to 1945, facing the adversary it was designed to fight, the Hellcat was exactly what the Navy needed. Its contribution to victory in the Pacific cannot be overstated. The Hellcat didn't just win air superiority, it obliterated the opposition. It allowed the US Navy to dominate the skies, protect the fleet, and support amphibious assaults across thousands of miles of ocean. Without the Hellcat, the island-hopping campaign that brought B-29s within range of Japan would have been immeasurably more costly. And yet the Hellcat remains underappreciated. David McCampbell's name is far less familiar than Pappy Boyington's or Dick Bong's. The Hellcat never raced at Reno, never starred in a TV series, never became a warbird darling. Of the 12,275 built, only 5 remain airworthy today, owned by collectors like Tom Friedkin, Paul Allen's Flying Heritage Collection, and the Commemorative Air Force. 3 more are undergoing restoration, which may yet spark a Hellcat renaissance. Perhaps the Hellcat's anonymity is the ultimate compliment. It did its job so well, so efficiently, and with so little drama that it became invisible. It was the professional's choice, the pilot's friend, the engineer's triumph, reliable, effective, unpretentious. The Corsair may have been the glamour queen, but the Hellcat won the war. For the aeroplane that secured American air superiority in the Pacific, destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other US fighter, and made possible the final victory over Japan. Perhaps it's time we gave the Grumman F6F Hellcat the recognition it deserves. Because when you look at the numbers, the kills, the sorties, the pilots brought home safely, the answer to our original question becomes clear. Should we ignore this Pacific hero? Absolutely not.